This story was initially uploaded to my channel several months ago, but there have been some recent developments that could pique your interest. I'll provide a timestamp in the description for anyone who prefers to skip the previous parts. My sisters, who have always seemed a bit entitled, insisted that I allow them to rent out my vacation home for their personal profit. Naturally, I declined their request. In response, their husbands took things much too far by breaking into the property, and now they are facing legal consequences as a result. Today, my parents decided to throw a barbecue, which seems to be a common activity among people of their age. Initially, I opted not to attend because I have a strained relationship with my two sisters, their husbands, and their kids. My wife and I have chosen to remain child-free, and I figured this outing would be nothing short of a typical gathering filled with tension. However, my mother pressured my wife to join, which ultimately led us to the barbecue. By the time we arrived, the scene was already bustling with about 20 guests. My sisters and their husbands were visibly intoxicated, having already indulged in quite a few drinks. Meanwhile, my mother was entirely focused on keeping her grandchildren, and a few of the neighborhood kids, aged between 7 and 11, entertained and somewhat under control. In a classic move, my father had strategically retreated to the whirlpool section of the pool, clutching a small cooler filled with beers to enjoy his own slice of relaxation. My wife and I made polite small talk with various acquaintances, sampled the food, and enjoyed frozen margaritas. However, my sisters and their husbands didn't waste any time criticizing us for arriving late, not being dressed in swimsuits, and supposedly ruining the overall vibe of the gathering. This was exactly the kind of suburban summer barbecue I had expected. About 45 minutes into the event, chaos erupted when two of the kids made a beeline for a neighbor who was standing next to the pool and decided to push her in. She was near the pool steps, stumbled, but miraculously didn't fall completely in. Still, she was clearly upset but chose not to make a scene. She simply walked over to the parents, grabbed her towel, dried herself off, and left. Meanwhile, my sisters and their husbands found the whole incident amusing, which only added to my irritation. A bit later, while I was engrossed in conversation with someone a few feet away from the water, I noticed 3 kids sprinting straight toward me from the corner of my eye. I had a feeling I was about to be involved in some sort of chaos. Not wanting to get tangled up with them, I jumped out of their way just in time, and all 3 kids ran straight into the pool at full speed. Most of the guests, including my wife and I, burst into laughter at the sight, but the kids' mothers, who were still quite drunk, completely lost their cool. It turned out that 2 of the kids didn't know how to swim, despite being in their swimsuits. As soon as I realized that, I took a step back from the pool, allowing others to lean in and pull the kids out. The unfortunate kids began to cry as though they were profoundly injured. This triggered absolute chaos. The intoxicated parents started yelling at everyone indiscriminately and directed their anger toward me for allegedly allowing their kids to nearly drown. To make matters worse, 2 of the children had been recording the stunt on their parents' iPhones, which were now sitting at the bottom of the pool. One of my sister's husbands attempted to dive in to retrieve the phones but quickly discovered that his physical condition, both his body mass index and blood alcohol content, rendered him incapable of helping. No one else was eager to assist, particularly since my sisters continued to complain loudly. Frustrated, I reminded my sisters that it was ultimately their responsibility to keep an eye on their children, and if anything had happened to them, it would have been their fault, not mine. This exchange escalated, and strong words flew back and forth between us. Eventually, my wife and I decided we'd had enough and left, especially after witnessing one of the husbands stumble and faceplant while yelling at us. Now, in the aftermath, they are insisting that I should have allowed the kids to knock me into the pool and ruin my phone for the sake of their entertainment. As a side note, my father, true to form, never left the whirlpool area throughout the entire ordeal. Reflecting on the situation, I recognize that the kids were simply acting like kids and enjoying themselves. However, their behavior is more indicative of their parents' lack of oversight than anything else. I just wish we hadn't attended the barbecue in the first place. While it's nice to see my parents and some of their neighbors, I find it increasingly difficult to tolerate my sisters and their husbands. There's a palpable sense of envy directed toward my wife and me, and the overall atmosphere is exhausting. As for my relationship with my sisters, it has always been an oil and water connection. Being 8 and 10 years older than me, we've never truly been close. Moreover, I don't share many common interests with their husbands, which only adds to the disconnect when we are all together. They're decent people, those guys, but honestly, I just can't bring myself to care about the things that matter to them, and it seems to be a two-way street. It's clear that the four of them harbor some envy towards our lifestyle. Both sisters have chosen the path of stay-at-home motherhood, while their husbands are doing quite well financially. One of them notably makes more than I do, but my wife and I are in the professional world, and we don't have children. This difference allows us to be much more prudent with our finances, leading to a portfolio filled with investments and a lifestyle that's distinctly different. Our cars remain clean, devoid of the usual chaos that comes with kids, and we have the luxury of taking nice vacations once or twice every year. This financial freedom and lifestyle choice definitely irk both sisters and, of course, their husbands too. As a result, we often find ourselves on the receiving end of some petty behaviors from them, which can be tiresome. Overall, neither my wife nor I find joy in spending time with them, which is why I was inclined to skip the recent get-together. It just doesn't seem worth the effort to me. My wife, on the other hand, is typically a positive individual who enjoys seeing them. I hope that at the next gathering she doesn't feel pressured to attend. Perhaps that would be a silver lining in this situation. She possesses a remarkable level of patience and forgiveness towards her siblings, far more than I do. However, during our drive home, it was apparent from her comments that she is also reaching her limit with them. As for my father, he really is an awesome guy. He has a laid-back demeanor and genuinely enjoys being around people. He used to work in sales, which has contributed to his sociable nature, and he takes pleasure in seeing others have a good time, especially in his retirement. At the barbecue, he and two friends comfortably settled in and enjoyed the show without any fuss. My mother is also quite cool, but the children's behavior did seem to upset her a bit. Speaking of the kids, they were fine by the time I left. When I departed, they were indoors, engrossed in a television show. Their ages ranged from 7 to 11, and the middle three, ages 9 and 10, were the ones who engaged me in a playful manner, likely egged on by the 11-year-old, who typically leads the charge in their antics. Regarding your comment about your parents hosting a barbecue, it's interesting to note that I had to condense my thoughts to fit within the character limit of the platform. My parents are very gregarious types who love to entertain. They have a classic house that's perfect for hosting gatherings and are always brainstorming reasons to hold get-togethers. They had originally planned for everyone to come over to celebrate the 4th of July, but one of my sisters and her family were on vacation. As a result, they decided to throw a pseudo 4th of July party, complete with flags, red, white, and blue decorations, a barbecue, a margarita machine, and promises of sparklers for the kids. Interestingly, my nieces and nephews were the only children present, as all of our neighbors are older, similar to my parents. An update on the situation as of August 17, 2023, nearly a month later, reveals that my folks informed me that my nieces and nephews have all become proficient swimmers and frequently use the pool. The 7-year-old is still a beginner, but he loves being in the water. My sister's earlier claims that they couldn't swim put them in a bit of a tight spot. To clarify, none of the children are allowed in the deep end, which was where the incident occurred. The two 10-year-olds and the 9-year-old had taken it upon themselves to try to push me into the pool after we left the party, with the 11-year-old likely encouraging them. The evening ended on a rather sour note when my intoxicated brother-in-law, after getting a bit too rowdy, face-planted while yelling at me and ended up needing to visit urgent care for stitches. He was in no condition to drive home, so my dad stepped in, though he was understandably displeased about the late-night excursion. Later that night, my sister initiated a group text that spiraled into some very hurtful comments, and their husbands chimed in as well. Consequently, my wife and I decided to block the four of them to establish some necessary boundaries. My mother, visibly upset by the harsh words exchanged, called me while she and my dad were still engaged in the group chat. I completely understood her distress due to the texts that had been sent. Insisting on clarity, my parents encouraged my sisters to come over the following day, sans children, to address the situation directly and set some ground rules. After some discussion, the result was a somewhat contrite, albeit unenthusiastic, apology delivered through my mom's phone. I was relieved that my wife was present during the conversation, as her stern glances kept me from saying too much in the heat of the moment. I simply thanked them and mentioned that I felt no need to delve deeper into the issue, assuming things had been resolved. That evening, I unblocked them, but shortly afterwards, I received a message from one of the brothers-in-law, inquiring about the cost of something, seemingly out of the blue. It was a rather awkward end to a tumultuous few days, highlighting just how complicated family dynamics can be. After receiving a text message inquiring about when I would be paying for certain expenses, I was taken aback. I immediately replied with a straightforward response, never. To emphasize my frustration, I took a screenshot of the message and forwarded it to my parents, explaining that I could no longer tolerate this ongoing nonsense. I firmly stated that we were going to go no contact with my sisters and their spouses, and I requested that my parents refrain from inviting us to any family gatherings or holidays involving them. Following this course of action, I blocked my sisters and their spouses on all communication platforms. This decision set off a chain reaction that escalated the situation significantly. My dad, upon learning of the conflict, took it upon himself to confront my sisters and their husbands. He expressed his anger in no uncertain terms, making it clear that their behavior was unacceptable. Among the stern messages he conveyed was the point that my children would not be welcome in his home for the foreseeable future, especially given that my mother frequently provided free babysitting for them. This revelation visibly rattled my sisters, who understood the implications of my father's words. Additionally, he informed them that they were banned from using the family vacation house, clarifying that my wife and I were the actual owners, not him and my mom. This news sent shockwaves through their families, who regularly utilized the vacation property for weekend getaways, often inviting friends to join. What was particularly surprising was the shift in my parents' demeanor. Historically, they had been quite easygoing, but it was evident that they had finally reached their breaking point. For context, it had always been my intention to keep the ownership of the vacation property under wraps, as it was a gift from my parents who had long desired a mountain getaway. Keeping this information private was my strategy to avert any potential drama with my siblings. Just a couple of days later, my sisters and their spouses showed up unannounced at our home, hoping to apologize face-to-face for the situation. Unfortunately, we were out to dinner at the time, so they left a note. One of my sisters also called me at work, but I chose to send her straight to voicemail. At this point, we had collectively decided that cutting off contact was in our best interest for the indefinite future. It had been over 3 weeks since we last interacted, and I was resolute in my decision to sever ties. The sentiment I felt was clear: I'm done with this drama, and they can figure things out on their own. Reflecting on the past few weeks, I have noticed a distinct improvement in our daily lives since blocking my sisters and their spouses. The low-level drama that used to plague our interactions was gone, leading to a newfound sense of peace. While I don't believe they are bad people, their behavior often felt tiresome and petty. As for the vacation property, I am indifferent about their use of it. Though the legal ownership rests with my wife and me, the original intention behind purchasing it was for our parents, allowing them to control and decide who could use it when they wanted. We take care of all the operating costs and taxes associated with the property. One positive outcome from this family blow-up is that we now have clarity on how we intend to manage the property in the future, especially as my parents age. Initially, I was prepared to take on the responsibility of managing the vacation home, including allocating weekends and maintaining the property. However, now we know that our approach will shift towards selling it instead. If we desire a mountain getaway in the future, we will simply rent an Airbnb. My parents, while not foolish, are generally very laid-back individuals who prefer to let things be. I anticipate they will soon come to terms with the situation, but that is ultimately up to them. Regardless, I have made it clear that we will not be participating in any family events for the foreseeable future. The unfortunate aspect for my sisters is that they likely harbor concerns about my role in their access to the vacation home. To clarify, I have no plans to restrict their usage of the cabin. That decision remains in the hands of my parents until they grow older. This situation has also put an end to one sister's dream of constructing a family compound on the property when it eventually passes to us. I have been aware of this desire for some time, but I chose to ignore it in the past. Typically, the lots in that area accommodate only a single house. However, this particular property is much larger and situated at the end of a road, allowing for the possibility of at least 3 homes with stunning views. It is evident that my sisters are not genuinely remorseful for their actions, rather, they are more fixated on what they can gain from the situation. I fully agree with this assessment and remain steadfast in my decision to keep my distance from them for the time being. Regarding the use of the vacation home, it ultimately falls to my parents to make that decision. Although I am the owner and cover the expenses, I purchased the property with the intention of providing a getaway space for my family, knowing that they would never have been able to afford such a place on their own. My financial stability, a result of diligent saving and investing, along with a significant bonus I received after selling my previous home and moving in with my wife, enabled me to make this gesture. As for my siblings using the house, I genuinely do not mind if my parents choose to let them. If my parents allow my sisters to use the house, I will admit I find a certain satisfaction in witnessing my sister's unease upon discovering that I could easily afford to purchase the property and allow my parents to use it while never disclosing this fact to them. Recently, my dad changed the lock code on the house after their visit last week, meaning that now only he, my mom, my wife, and I have access to it. Regarding my mom's role in babysitting the kids, she has informed me that, once a week, she and occasionally my dad have been visiting each of my sisters' homes to spend the day with their children. With the school year beginning, Mom plans to pick each set of kids up from school on different days, taking them home to spend the evening together. Though she admits that having all 5 kids together can be overwhelming, she finds it much more manageable when they are with her one-on-one. Mom and Dad have both expressed their intention to refrain from having my sisters and their families visit them at their home in the near future, and they are quite enjoying the peace and quiet. It seems they may have grown weary of the previous family dynamics and have used the recent pool party debacle as an opportunity to redefine these relationships. An interesting note regarding a social media post that was removed from a platform: according to a message I just read from one of the moderators, the content was taken down due to reported property damage, which I still don't fully understand. The incident involved a ruined phone, which seems rather absurd. On August 26, 2023, after 9 days from my last update, a significant amount has transpired. Although I initially believed the situation had reached a breaking point, what unfolded this week was more akin to a minor inconvenience compared to the revelations that came to light. To provide a clearer understanding, some financial context is necessary. My parents have never been particularly adept at saving money. As I have been managing their taxes for years, I have a comprehensive grasp of their financial standing. Their house is fully paid off, and they carry minimal debt, but they haven't set aside much for retirement. Both of them receive Social Security. My dad has a decent pension, and they have a small savings cushion, but they certainly do not have a hidden treasure trove waiting for them. As a thoughtful gesture after their retirement, I purchased their current car, allowing them to enjoy a reliable vehicle for the first time in 2 decades since they had always leased their cars before. My sisters, on the other hand, operate under the misconception that our parents have an abundance of financial resources and will be leaving significant assets to them. Since I am financially stable and do not require any additional funds, they have never prioritized saving either. Recently, I learned that my oldest sister and her husband, who have 3 children, have been living beyond their means for quite some time and are currently facing substantial financial difficulties. They have maxed out their credit cards and are falling behind on their car leases, with one vehicle about to be repossessed. Despite his previous claims of earning a substantial salary, it turns out that his actual income is roughly half of what he had boasted. On Tuesday, my sister confided in my mom about their dire situation, admitting they need a loan. This revelation shocked my parents, especially when it came to light that, instead of regularly staying at the vacation house, she has been renting it out once a month for the past 3 years, pocketing the rental income. We're talking about sums exceeding $2,000 for a weekend stay and at least $4,000 for a week. Now that my sister has been cut off from using the house, she has already canceled one booking and is becoming increasingly anxious about the prospect of losing everything they have. My parents are not in a financial position to provide them with a loan. My other sister was aware of the rental arrangement but has never mentioned it, which makes me suspect she may have engaged in similar behavior. I recall a time I visited the vacation house to drop off an ATV I had repaired, and I encountered a family there who claimed to be staying with my sister. They explained that my sister and her family had gone out for errands, and while I initially dismissed it, I had always wondered if there was more to the story. This newfound knowledge about my sister's financial missteps has been relayed to me by my parents, both of whom are understandably stressed about the implications. My mom is particularly affected, while my dad is primarily angry about the whole situation. I know he feels a sense of betrayal and, undoubtedly, a measure of embarrassment that he is unable to assist his daughter in her time of need. He has reiterated that, as long as it is up to him, my sisters will not be able to use the house again. As long as the decision rests with me, it appears that my sisters won't be getting any use out of the vacation home in the near future. My parents had filled me in on the ongoing situation, anticipating that my sisters would soon turn their attention toward me to pressure for access to the mountain retreat. They were spot on, as this past Thursday, my sisters showed up at our place again, this time unaccompanied by their husbands, and they lingered outside the door, clearly waiting for my arrival. Upon getting home, I faced an immediate dilemma. If I entered without letting them in, I would be inviting a public confrontation and a potential scene that could be witnessed by neighbors. So, I opted to let them in, thinking it was the lesser of 2 evils. Once inside, my older sister launched into a rehearsed story about why I urgently needed to allow them to use the mountain place again. My younger sister stood by to reinforce her points, echoing the claim that I had been a terrible brother and that it was my duty to step up and even consider paying for their children's college education, since that's apparently what family does. I allowed them to present their case, listening patiently while they laid out their arguments in a well-coordinated effort to sway me. Once they concluded, I decided it was time to confront them, armed with the information my parents had shared with me. What followed was a chaotic mix of emotions. Their initial denial morphed into tears, which escalated to cursing and shouting. I swear, my ears are still ringing from the noise 2 days later. I won't pretend that I was completely civil during the exchange. I said some harsh and unforgiving things, but nothing that wasn't grounded in truth. After about an hour of back and forth, they finally departed. Later that day, I took a shower to wash off the tension and stretched out for a brief rest. When I finally got up, my wife had returned home. The first thing she mentioned was that she had to block several phone numbers because my sisters had bombarded our phones, reaching out from new numbers in a frantic attempt to get through to me. The situation escalated further when my parents messaged me the next day, asking for a phone call. I can only imagine that my sisters have shared their own skewed interpretation of the events that transpired, but I'm not in the mood to relive the drama just yet. Normally, I am a pretty upbeat person, but this family conflict has taken a toll on me, leaving me feeling drained. I mustered just enough energy to make the drive up to the vacation house, where I padlocked the entrance gate securely. As the sole key holder, I figured this measure would deter my siblings from accessing the place without my consent. I can picture them struggling to scale the challenging 400-yard uphill trek just to reach the house, quite the feat, indeed. Fast forward 2.5 weeks from my last update, and the saga with my extended family has taken yet another turn. Following the confrontation with my sisters, my parents informed me that they were done managing the vacation home. It became clear that my sisters had been applying pressure on them to regain access to the property. In a surprising turn of events, my parents decided to hand over the responsibility for the vacation home entirely to me, effectively placing the burden on my shoulders moving forward. Until then, they had kept meticulous records of who accessed the home and had been responsible for its routine maintenance and any necessary repairs or replacements. They ultimately chose to step back to avoid being caught in the middle of this family turmoil. I can't say I blame them, but I am disappointed because the vacation home was supposed to be a space for them to enjoy, a retreat where they could spend time together. They had been regular visitors, and I've never minded them sharing it with my sisters and their families. I always thought it was up to my parents to decide as they were the ones who technically owned the property, even if I hold the title. But now, with my parents relinquishing their access, the entire dynamic shifts. In response to this new reality, I've taken several protective measures to secure the property. As previously mentioned, I locked the entrance gate with a heavy-duty chain and the best lock I could find. Additionally, I completely reset all the door keypads, creating new access codes to ensure that only trusted individuals could enter. Just yesterday, I installed security cameras around the property, which turned out to be quite a worthwhile investment. The installer even suggested positioning a high-resolution camera overlooking the valley, which I'm glad I opted for, despite the costs exceeding my initial expectations. The peace of mind it provides is invaluable. The installer also placed signs around the property indicating that the area is monitored by video surveillance, which should serve as a deterrent to any unauthorized access. I went a step further by installing a heavy-duty lockout for the water shut-off drain valve. I truly hope to lose the keys for it because if I misplace them, removing that lock will be a significant hassle. I haven't mentioned this strategy to anyone except my wife. Only she and I know that the water is locked off, and we are the sole key holders. Last week, I received separate phone calls at my office from both of my brothers-in-law. Each tried to persuade me to reconsider my stance on the vacation home, hinting that I might have been a bit too harsh in my reactions and responses during the heated discussions with my sisters. The pressure continues to mount, but I stand firm in my resolve. The ongoing negotiations regarding the use of the vacation house have taken an unexpected turn. The elder sibling had gone up to the house with a group of friends, eager for a weekend getaway. However, he faced an unfortunate predicament when he discovered that he couldn't get past the locked gate. This oversight left him visibly frustrated and embarrassed, a feeling I could only imagine was amplified by the disappointment of being shut out from what he anticipated would be an enjoyable time. During our phone conversation, his emotions oscillated between being forceful and adopting a victim mentality. At one point, he angrily threatened to remove the gate entirely, clearly indicating his irritation with the situation. In an unexpected admission, he also revealed that they had been renting the property out to friends, claiming that they needed the money from these rentals. He accused me of ruining their little business venture and insisted that I should refund their guests, which I found utterly outrageous. I wish I had recorded this conversation for proof, but I wasn't sure how to do that using the office phone. The other sibling on the call seemed reluctant and appeared to be coerced into making the call by my sister. When I firmly told him not to expect to use the house again, he didn't resist. Ultimately, I reiterated my stance that they could no longer use the property and stressed that they should not ask a second time. At this point, I have begun to seriously consider selling the vacation home. My wife and I recognize that we won't be using it often enough to justify its upkeep, especially since there aren't any family gatherings in the works. I broached the topic of selling it with my parents, and their reaction was rather indifferent, essentially conveying that it was my decision to make. With the property consisting of 3 lots that offer stunning views at the end of a private road, I know I could more than double my investment by selling it. However, I think it would be wise to hold off on that decision for now, as acting impulsively in an emotional state could cloud my judgment. Currently, communication with my sisters is non-existent, and I have no intention of reaching out. I am also unsure about their relationship with our parents and prefer to steer clear of any potential familial tension. On a positive note, my parents and I enjoyed an evening together last week, dining at a lovely new restaurant. No one brought up the issues surrounding the vacation house, which provided a welcome distraction. My mom did share updates about the grandchildren, mentioning that she's been spending quality time with them at their homes. As for an update on the house situation, I hired a property manager to oversee the vacation home. He is local and manages several properties, including vacation rentals and weekend getaways like ours. He has access to the camera feeds I installed, performs physical checks on the house every week or two, and seems to have a pretty laid-back but responsible job. He even takes his dog along during his visits, making it seem more like a pleasant stroll than a chore. He also manages a camera system that captures images of any vehicles passing by at the beginning of the private road, which adds another layer of security. The cost for his services is $450 per month, and he also does simple maintenance and repairs at an hourly rate. Having someone who is familiar with the local law enforcement has provided me with a sense of comfort, knowing there's someone looking out for the property. During dinner recently, my parents faced a bit of pressure from my sisters, who wanted them to persuade me to reopen the vacation home for Thanksgiving. This event has become somewhat of a family tradition over the years, although my wife and I have only attended once in the last 5 years. My dad, understanding my firm stance, chose not to press the issue, fully aware that I would decline any requests. Instead, they devised a clever alternative. They would organize the Thanksgiving gathering and propose that everyone contribute to renting an Airbnb in the mountains. If that didn't work out, they would either host it at their home or one of my sisters could step in. This plan led to some discord between the sisters, as the middle sibling was enthusiastic about the Airbnb idea, while the oldest sister faced financial constraints. As the deadline for committing to the Airbnb passed, it became apparent that Thanksgiving would be held at my parents' house, regardless of our lack of attendance. My parents have expressed their desire for us not to sell the vacation home just yet, as they would still like to utilize it occasionally. This ongoing situation continues to unfold, without a hint of resolution in sight. There has been a lot of discussion and reflection regarding the family vacation home. While my parents express a desire to occasionally use the property, they are also aware of how my sisters are still adjusting to the changes in our family dynamics. It seems that everyone would prefer if we could gather there again as a family in the future. However, I have come to terms with the reality that this may not be feasible. At this juncture, I would prefer to sell the property and move forward. That said, I can tolerate keeping it if my parents plan to use it every so often, especially since it is likely to appreciate in value over time. My wife and I have chosen to maintain a no-contact stance with my sisters and their husbands. Interestingly, both sisters have reached out to me from different phone numbers, likely utilizing services like Google Voice, to insist that I meet with them. They claim this is for the sake of our parents, hoping to discuss how we can all share the family vacation home. In a somewhat invasive manner, they even reached out to my wife. Thankfully, I have remained vigilant about not responding to calls from numbers I don't recognize, which has helped me avoid their attempts at communication. It's difficult to determine if my sisters genuinely believe they can manipulate me into allowing them access again or if they are simply disconnected from the reality of the situation. Regardless, their motives do not concern me. My parents have informed me that the oldest sister and her husband are in the process of unloading their SUV and large truck, as well as selling their jet skis and other possessions they never truly needed. This transition is likely to be challenging for her, as she has a tendency to boast about her lifestyle and possessions. The husband is particularly invested in his truck, his identity seems intertwined with it, even going so far as to have a tattoo of the truck's brand. This obsession is one of the many reasons I never formed a close friendship with him. Several people have suggested that I consider turning the vacation home into an Airbnb. While I recognize that doing so could be financially beneficial, I have no intention of pursuing this option in the near future. I understand it would generate income, but the potential for familial drama is far too great, particularly for my parents, who do not need the added stress. Beyond that, managing the transition would involve removing personal items that my parents have stored in the home, and there is simply no space to relocate those belongings. There would also inevitably be wear and tear on the property, and even with a manager to handle the logistics, it would still require a considerable amount of time and effort on my part. For me, the benefits do not outweigh the challenges. As for the recent developments, I have decided to hold off on posting updates, hoping for a moment of calm. However, events have escalated significantly. In a shocking twist, my brothers-in-law broke into the vacation home. They were subsequently arrested and faced charges of breaking and entering, destruction of property, and making threats, all classified as Class 1 misdemeanors. I have made it clear that I will not drop the charges against them, although I might reconsider if they fully compensate me for the damages they caused. As of last Saturday evening, they were still incarcerated, but I assume they have been released by now. Initially, I thought things had settled down, as I hadn't heard from my sisters in over 6 weeks. My parents took a week to visit the vacation home and genuinely enjoyed their time there. I hired a property manager named David, who has been doing an excellent job. He has already completed a couple of repairs I requested and is working from a list of further tasks I've provided. David also sends me photos of the local wildlife or picturesque sunsets each week, which has made me consider visiting the property again, especially after Thanksgiving. Unfortunately, I received distressing news. The brothers-in-law managed to gain unauthorized access by using an angle grinder to cut through the driveway gate, damaging it in the process. They attempted to break in through the front door, which resulted in ruining the lock and severely gouging the door. Ultimately, they gained entry through the utility door and a locked internal door. They also broke into the barn for reasons that remain unclear. Their escapade ended when they exited through the front door, where they were met by sheriff's deputies and David, who had received activity notifications from the camera system. He promptly notified the sheriff's department. According to David, the brothers-in-law tried to explain their way out of the situation, but the deputies were not convinced. Breaking into an unoccupied house is indeed a serious offense, and now the consequences of their actions are unfolding. Typically, it's the meth heads who storm into places and ransack them, but this situation took a different turn. When the Bills were arrested, they completely lost it. They started yelling threats and made big promises about how they were going to beat the hell out of me, which is genuinely not the smartest move to make in front of cops. Meanwhile, David and the sheriff's office attempted to reach out to my wife and me to figure out what we wanted to do about the whole mess. However, we were spending a leisurely day with her parents and, to really soak in the vacation mood, we had left our phones in the car. Consequently, they went ahead and booked the Bills on all charges, which was precisely what I would have wanted them to do anyway. The Bills, seemingly in a panic, called their wives from jail. Understandably, their spouses freaked out about the situation. They tried reaching out to my parents, but since I had blocked their calls, that didn't get very far either. In a frantic scramble, they sought out a local lawyer for bail arrangements, which is no simple task, especially in a rural area during a holiday weekend. To make matters worse, the older sister of one of the Bills didn't have any cash, and her credit cards were maxed out, creating a situation where if they managed to bail out, my middle sister would end up having to foot the bill for both of them. As of Saturday afternoon, I was aware that they were still in jail. My wife and I didn't check our phones until late Friday, on the drive home from the in-laws. When I finally looked at my phone, it was overwhelming. Calls and messages were flooding in from my mom, dad, David, and the sheriff's department. It felt like they had ruined an otherwise perfect day. Until that moment, I had been in such a good mood, blissfully unaware of the chaos. My wife took it upon herself to sift through the barrage of texts and voicemails, reading them out loud to me as we drove home. By the time we arrived back, I had gathered a clearer picture of the situation, but I struggled to shake off the anger that had begun to bubble to the surface. I called David to get the full rundown on the events that had transpired and learned just how extensive the damage was, which only fueled my rage further. I ended that Friday evening by contacting the sheriff's department and made it abundantly clear that there was no misunderstanding, the Bills had no right to be on my property, and I wanted to press charges against them. I deliberately chose not to return my parents' calls, feeling overwhelmed and restless. It wasn't until Saturday afternoon that I finally reached out to my folks. Both of them sounded really shaken up by the whole ordeal. My mom, in particular, seemed especially upset. My sisters had pressured them into suggesting I tell the cops it was all a mistake and that I wanted to drop the charges. I refused outright, stating there was no chance I would do that without first consulting an attorney and without compensation for all the damages they caused. By the time we hung up, my mom was in tears, which certainly weighed heavily on my conscience. My dad proposed a complete fresh start, but he also insisted that the Bills needed to pay for what they had done. I still hadn't been up to the property yet, feeling utterly helpless. I knew seeing the damage firsthand would drive me insane, especially with the photos I had already seen, which were bad enough. I hoped to make the trip on either Sunday or Wednesday, but my job doesn't allow me to just take off for non-emergencies. I left messages with a couple of attorney friends to see if they could recommend someone suitable to handle the situation, particularly to pursue legal action against my sisters and the Bills. I wasn't entirely sure of all the options available, but I was seriously contemplating getting restraining orders against them. I had saved all the texts they had sent me, which I hoped would serve as useful evidence. I was also strongly considering suing them for any money they made while renting the place out. While I didn't care much about the cash itself, I thought it would be a fitting way to make their lives as miserable as possible. At this point, I was done holding back, the gloves were off. On a couple of side notes, I had made sure that the Bills had no idea I had hired someone to monitor the property or that there were now cameras set up. My parents were aware of these developments but kept it to themselves, understanding that sharing that information would only give my sisters a reason to stir up more drama. Furthermore, there were clear signs around the property indicating that it was under surveillance and that trespassing was prohibited. As for my wife, she had reached her breaking point. I completely understood her frustration. She had been incredibly patient throughout this ordeal, but she finally made it clear that she had enough. She told me it was my responsibility to handle this situation, but she felt strongly that they all needed to learn a hard lesson from their actions. In the grand scheme of things, the older Bill probably wouldn't face any real consequences at his job, but the middle Bill had a security clearance, which could potentially complicate things for him. I held on to the hope that this would motivate him to take responsibility and pay for the damages incurred. Pay for the damages himself immediately. David, the caretaker, has a fascinating background. Initially, I thought he had formed friendships with some local deputies simply because they were all familiar faces in the community. However, I discovered I was mistaken. David had an extensive career as a police officer in a large city, where he faced life-threatening situations and was shot while on duty. This traumatic experience profoundly affected him, leading him to decide to leave the force. Following his retirement, he chose to relocate to the area where his parents had settled. As a result of his experiences, he struggles with PTSD, and his dog serves as a certified service animal, providing him with much-needed support. It is typically understood that individuals in law enforcement share a bond, which likely explains how David formed friendships with the deputies in the area. I find myself grappling with a conflicting desire. On one hand, I want nothing more than to avoid seeing or speaking to these individuals who have caused me distress for the rest of my life. On the other hand, there is an undeniable urge within me to make their lives as difficult as possible. Many people have advised me to adopt a hard-nosed approach regarding this situation from the outset. However, I have refrained from doing so primarily because I did not want to add unnecessary stress to my parents' lives. I have never been fond of drama, but the current circumstances have reached a point where my parents are already feeling the pressure. My wife has effectively opted out of becoming further involved in this situation. She prefers not to hear any more about it for the time being and has indicated that the responsibility now falls to me. While she has left that part of the conversation open-ended, it seems clear that she intends to distance herself from this issue, aside from being a sounding board for me to express my frustrations. Regarding the motivations behind the break-in, my suspicions are purely conjectural, but I believe they may have intended to use the property for family getaways and possibly even to rent it out again. According to David, the property manager, deer season lasts until the end of the year, and I know from past experiences that the group has utilized the property as a base camp for extensive hunting trips. The vacation home accommodates a significant number of guests, and hosting a single event could yield substantial profits. While I am speculating, this perspective could help explain why they chose to break into the barn. A few years back, I purchased a 6-seater mule, which they likely wanted to use but did not want to damage the property in the process. The home holds considerable sentimental value for my father, and it's evident that they both have a great deal of respect for him. Fast forward to December 2nd, 2023, just 5 days later. I didn't expect to feel compelled to post again so soon, but a significant amount has transpired over the last couple of days. In brief, it seems we may have turned a corner regarding this entire situation. On Thursday afternoon, I received a courier-delivered envelope at my office. Inside, I found a signed letter from both of my brothers-in-law along with a cashier's check for $5,000. The letter conveyed what I can only describe as a genuine and heartfelt apology. They acknowledged breaking into the property and recognized that their actions were wrong. The check was intended to cover the damages, and they expressed their willingness to pay additional costs if necessary. Furthermore, they promised to stay away from the vacation home unless my wife and I specifically invited them. They also requested that I do my best to have the charges dropped as quickly as possible, citing the risk of job loss for both of them. They mentioned being willing to agree to a restraining order or any other measures needed to facilitate that outcome. While there were additional conciliatory remarks, these points encapsulated the essence of their message. To say I was shocked by this development would be a significant understatement, as it marked a stark departure from their previous behavior. Prior to receiving this letter, I had already made an appointment with an attorney to discuss the possibility of pursuing legal action against my brothers-in-law for the damages incurred and to explore obtaining a restraining order. After reading the letter, I contacted my attorney and informed him of the unexpected correspondence. He agreed to meet with me at the end of the day instead of our originally scheduled time next week. During our 2-hour meeting, he recommended that my wife and I consider pursuing a settlement and mutual release agreement with all 4 of them, our sisters and brothers-in-law. He explained that while we would almost certainly win if we opted for a lawsuit, we could be looking at a legal battle lasting 2 years or more, along with considerable upfront legal fees, with no guarantee of ever seeing any money. Additionally, he mentioned that we could accept the $5,000 free and clear even if we chose not to let them off the hook. He is currently drafting the agreement, which won't be ready until Monday and will contain terms that essentially function as the civil equivalent of a restraining order. I had previously reached out to my property manager to arrange for a bid on the necessary repairs resulting from the damage. After the meeting, I called him again, emphasizing the urgency of obtaining a close estimate for the costs as soon as possible. By that Friday, he informed me that he anticipated the total repair expenses would be approximately $4,000, with the majority of that amount earmarked for replacing the front door. On the same day, my attorney took the initiative to contact each of the individuals involved in the incident we were discussing, clearly laying out the restitution we were proposing. He also advised them to seek legal counsel for themselves, which they both agreed to do. During the discussion, one of the individuals expressed that they felt they could afford either to cover the damages or to hire a lawyer, but not both. They concluded that hiring an attorney likely wouldn't change the outcome, particularly since they had little to no defense for their actions. Their primary concern revolved around whether the charges could be dropped. From what I gathered, they appeared to be prepared to do whatever it took to resolve this situation, even if that meant signing documents that could expedite the process. Additionally, on that Friday, my attorney reached out to the district attorney's office to discuss the potential for dismissing the charges against the individuals. He managed to obtain the name of the prosecutor assigned to the case and left a message, though he had yet to make direct contact. He expressed optimism that the charges might be dismissed, mainly because the individuals were willing to pay restitution and had no prior offenses. However, he reminded me that he wasn't a criminal lawyer, and his assessment wasn't definitive. He also advised that I should be ready to drive to the DA's office early the following week, either Monday or Tuesday, to advocate in person for the dismissal of the charges. Moreover, he stressed the importance of maintaining no contact with my sisters and the individuals involved, particularly over the next 6 months. Adhering strictly to the terms of the agreement regarding future interactions would be crucial. I suspect that the shift in the individual's willingness to comply stems from their realization of what was at stake. They likely understood the potential financial burden of legal fees and fines, along with the slim chance of incarceration, which could last up to 120 days. Additionally, one of them held a security clearance for their job, which would be in jeopardy due to this issue. This desperation to maintain their regular lives seemed to drive their sudden change of heart. While this resolution may not be ideal, it at least allows me to move forward past the legal and financial turmoil that had consumed my life for several months. I have little doubt that I will never again have a civil relationship with any of these individuals, and truthfully, that's perfectly fine with me. My primary aim now is to close this chapter, continue with my life, and completely divest myself from any further interaction with them. I am exhausted by the entire ordeal, and my wife shares much of the same sentiment. Interestingly, the receipt of a written apology from them was a surprisingly significant moment for me. I had never anticipated that they would take such a step, but it turns out that it means a lot more to me than I realized. At this juncture, the financial compensation doesn't hold much weight, however, I acknowledge that I will accept it without hesitation. I have a strong feeling that my middle sister and her husband contributed the funds, as the cashier's check bore the name of the credit union connected to his employer. Once we finalize the paperwork, I plan to provide one final update, likely as an edit to this post. Writing these updates serves as a helpful way to clear my head, and I have genuinely appreciated the feedback and support from everyone who has commented. I sincerely hope that none of you ever find yourselves in a situation like this one. Reflecting on Thursday night, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief when I arrived home. The thought that this might finally be over brought me to tears. I have chosen not to discuss the settlement with my family until all parties have signed the agreement. While my sisters and their spouses may choose to talk about it if they wish, I will refrain from engaging in those discussions, as it's fundamentally a matter that needs to remain between me and the individuals involved. Fast forward to December 7, 2023, just 5 days later, I met with my attorney on Tuesday morning to review the agreement once again. We made a few minor adjustments before he sent the revised document over to my sisters and brothers-in-law. The agreement included a stipulation requiring them to cover my attorney's fees, which amount to approximately $3,000. Unsurprisingly, they were not pleased with this condition and attempted to negotiate its removal. However, my attorney firmly stated that they must accept the terms as they were presented. There would be no deal if they refused. If they did not comply, we would proceed with a lawsuit seeking the money they received from renting out the property, including claims for wear and tear associated with that renting. The situation of dealing with the wear and tear from renting the vacation property has been incredibly frustrating. Not only are there the substantial repair costs stemming from the break-in that caused extensive damage, but I also have to consider the emotional toll it has taken on me and my family. The stress of navigating through lost income due to this whole ordeal, including the necessity of hiring legal representation to handle the complexities of the case, has compounded the situation. In discussions with my attorney, I was informed that I should be prepared to pursue every possible avenue for justice, including working closely with the district attorney's office to ensure that those responsible for this mess face appropriate consequences. On a particular day when my sisters were present to sign documents related to the case, I was not there, but I later heard that the atmosphere was quite charged. According to reports, one of my sisters stood up to speak, and it escalated to the point where the middle sibling, Bill, took control and made an abrupt demand for everyone to quiet down or he would abandon the discussion and strike a deal directly with me. His frustration was palpable, and he made it clear he was not interested in playing nice with anyone else involved. Eventually, they came up with a cashier's check for $2,500, claiming that was the maximum they could offer. Though it was far less than what was deserved, I decided to accept it as a final payment to put this chapter behind us. I was informed by my attorney that the atmosphere in the room was frosty and strained, but somehow, everyone managed to maintain composure long enough to finalize the necessary paperwork before leaving without escalating tensions any further. After these tense exchanges, I drove to the vacation house early yesterday morning to assess the damage for myself and to have a meeting with the district attorney's office. Witnessing the destruction firsthand was infuriating. It felt utterly senseless and unnecessary. My anger boiled over, and I found myself contemplating the idea of absorbing the repair costs just so I could take action against those responsible and make their lives difficult. Despite attempts to cool down and walk off my frustration, I found it impossible to shake off the intensity of my emotions. Ultimately, I reached out to a close friend who was kind enough to listen as I vented my feelings for over an hour. His support refocused my thoughts on the bigger picture, the importance of moving on and resolving things as gracefully as possible. While I'm still grappling with the desire to retaliate for what has been done, I managed to regain some composure and grabbed lunch, which helped ease my troubled mind. Later, I headed to the DA's office unannounced and had to wait for a bit, but I eventually met with the assistant DA assigned to my case. The main takeaway from our conversation was that since I was reluctant to press charges and the damages were already covered financially, they were willing to drop most of the charges except for the trespassing claim. This charge would become a Class 2 misdemeanor, meaning Bill would have to plead guilty and accept whatever penalty the judge decides. I was informed that if they dared to contest the trespassing charge or get involved in any further trouble, they could face severe repercussions. Thankfully, their initial cooperation in not resisting arrest helped facilitate this agreement. I also took the time to visit the sheriff's office to express my gratitude for their swift response during the break-in. Unfortunately, I was only able to speak with the dispatch person and not the deputies directly, but I wanted to ensure they knew how much I appreciated their efforts. I tried to connect with David, the property manager, for a follow-up discussion, but I couldn't reach him. As part of the agreement reached, there are specific terms in place, including a no-contact clause. Essentially, this means that if any of them appear where my wife or I are, or vice versa, the one who arrived last must leave immediately. All communication between us must be channeled through attorneys or mutually acceptable third parties. They are permitted to retain any income they generated from renting the vacation house, which I recognize may come with potential tax implications that they will need to manage. Furthermore, both parties are released from any additional liabilities relating to this situation up to the present moment. While the agreement contains more details, these are the key points that clarify our current standing. Later today, my wife and I plan to sign the finalized agreement. At that point, I will be unable to discuss many specifics, though I can share observations surrounding the situation. This update may well be my last regarding this whole ordeal, but I will attempt to respond to any comments as time allows. Engaging with those who have read and offered perspectives on this matter has played a significant role in helping me process everything in a relatively constructive manner. I appreciate everyone's insights during this challenging time. Despite the temptation to seek revenge, I am relieved that I chose a path of resolution. Should the other parties provoke further issues later on, I might have regrets about my decision, but I hope that if they adhere to our agreement, we can avoid any future conflicts altogether. The family dynamics are as strained as many have noted, and I have only disclosed to my parents that we are working towards a resolution, leaving out the details, which may or may not align with their expectations moving forward. I made the choice to prioritize what was best for my wife and me. I suspect that my sisters have shared a distorted version of events with others, which has created additional obstacles for me to navigate. The arrangement we have is simply a more formal acknowledgement of how things have been for the past several months. While I recognize that this isn't how my parents envisioned things turning out, I feel content with the direction we've taken. As for my sisters, they've never really shown such a sense of entitlement towards me before. Sure, we weren't super close, but we managed to get along without any significant issues. However, it seems that things started to change when I purchased my loft at the age of 25. At that time, neither of my sisters owned a home, yet both had found their future husbands. It was clear they harbored some resentment about me securing a property before they did. The situation only got more complicated when I met my wife. She comes from a wealthy family, and by then, I had also started to achieve financial success on my own. This led to accusations of elitism directed at me from my sisters. After our wedding, I moved into my wife's condo, which was conveniently located near her fellowship program, and I sold the loft. While our wedding was fairly fancy, I thought it was reasonable, yet my sisters and their spouses couldn't seem to shake their envy. This changed the dynamic between us, their pettiness became apparent, and we began to limit our interactions with them. The profit I made from selling the loft, along with living frugally, without a house payment, was what allowed me to purchase the vacation home for my parents. They were fine with the arrangement of keeping my ownership under wraps because they knew my sisters would have a field day with it, accusing me of using my wife's money. The truth is, most of our finances are kept separate. Until the recent turmoil began, I genuinely believed that our relationship was stable. It became evident that while our daily lives were different, I didn't think my sisters actually harbored any hatred towards me. I was aware that both had developed a somewhat spoiled attitude, but I hadn't let it bother me directly. I also didn't have any real disagreements with my brothers-in-law, as we simply had little in common. Reflecting on this situation, it's surprising how misguided I was about their feelings. My hope is that, moving forward, I won't have to hear from them again.